Good morning, everyone. Matanwa, and welcome to our second keynote of Celtic Knot 2020. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined this morning by the inimitable Darach Ó Séaghdha. For those of us tuning in from Ireland, I think it goes without saying that Darach probably needs absolutely no introduction, but for those of you tuning in from all around the world, he's, I suppose, Darach, his podcast, Mother Folklore, and I suppose specifically the Twitter stream that kind of started all of it, the Irish Four, has become somewhat synonymous with, it's probably a little bit trite to say, a renaissance or perhaps a blooming of Irish in a more accessible and friendly way than perhaps Irish people have been used to through our schooling and things like that. This ended up with a set of books, Mother Folklore and Crack Baby, its sequel, talking about kind of your relationship with Irish and how you came back to it as an adult. But I'm sure Darach is going to wow you and entertain you with all of the work that he's been doing over the last few years. So I will, without further ado, I'll hand over to Darach. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Dave, everybody, and thank you very much for having me here. And I'm absolutely delighted. Thank you so much for being. I'm so glad to be invited to give a keynote address here at the Celtic Knot Conference. It's just a great honor. And thank you to Rebecca and for Claire Murray for asking me to be here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a writer and a podcaster. I wrote these two, which are available in all good bookshops, Mother Folklore and Crack Baby. And hang on one second. Of course, technical issues from the start. We have. So my published work to date has focused on the Irish language and how it features as a fixture in life in Ireland. So how the Irish language is a thread that connects things as different as computer coding, the legal system, choosing baby names and choosing schools, ordering a coffee in Starbucks, getting a tattoo, and Irish mythology. And I'm still finding new connections every day. So I think the idea that very different topics can be connected by a number of steps is something that's very familiar to Wikipedians. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the way information moves when it's free and how that contradicts the culture of hyper-specialization that seems to be really taking root at the moment. So that concerns me a fair bit. So to give you an example of how you can get these connections between different subjects and how Wikipedia celebrates that. This morning I looked up the entry for Peter Pan. And by just following the hyperlinks in each article, I was able to get from Peter Pan to the 1916 Rising in 8 steps. So with what 8 steps? Peter Pan led me to the Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. J.M. Barrie, when he died, he bequeathed the copyright to his work to the hospital. And the Great Ormond Street Hospital page led me to an entry on bone marrow transplants, which is a procedure they conduct there. The entry on bone marrow transplants took me to the Berlin patient who was the first person in the world to present what they call prolonged post-treatment control of HIV, the first person to present as untraceable with HIV. And that led me to the Berlin patient, led me to the city of Berlin itself. If you've ever been to Berlin, you know it has many museums, and one of which is linked there. It's the Berlin Jewish Museum, and which is designed by a very famous architect called Daniel Libeskind. And when you click on his page, you can see he also designed the Bord Gáis Energy Theatre in Dublin. And that theatre's page tells us that in 2016 it hosted a centenary commemoration of the Easter Rising. So that's from Peter Pan to 1916 in 8 steps. I could have taken a completely different 8 steps from the links. I could have gone from Peter Pan to Captain Hook, to pirates, to women pirates, to Bronn Whale, Great Somalia, as she's sometimes known according to screenwriters, to Taoiseach. Her husband had the title of Taoiseach, which was a title which was revived when Ireland became a parliamentary system to be used as a vice prime minister. And so that the page on Taoiseach led me to Dáil Éireann, which is the Irish Parliament, which led me to the first Dáil, which was set up after the Easter Rising. Again, 8 steps. I'm sure I could probably go back from 1916 to Peter Pan to an entirely different set of pages with different disciplines, different subject matters, as all seemingly unrelated, but all clearly related. What of it? Who cares? Well, I'm going to come to that. But first I want to talk a little about my relationship with knowledge, culture, community growing up in Dublin in the 1990s and how the internet in general, and Wikipedia in particular, rebooted these. It was different growing up having an offline childhood. So the story I'm going to tell you starts in a classroom of 12-year-old boys in Rathfarnham in 1990. The teacher introduces all the boys to a lady who works in the parish, who's going to be talking to them for the rest of the afternoon. And this isn't completely unusual. We had guest speakers frequently enough to talk about water safety or the dangers of smoking. But this session, the first of 6, and in the time slots that had significantly, these are the time slots that had previously been allocated to preparing us for confirmation. These ones were a bit more memorable because we were going to get the lowdown finally on what puberty was and how babies are made. Any Irish person who attended a Catholic school in the late 20th century will have similar stories to tell. Shocking tales of indestructible sperm cells living on surfaces for days, causing accidental pregnancy from the slightest contact. The dangers of all known artificial contraception methods, the perils of self-pollution. STIs are mentioned briefly without being distinguished from each other, and only is the punchline in schadenfreude-laden anecdotes about premarital sex. Homosexuality did get a mention, or more precisely, its existence wasn't denied, but not as something anyone in the class would have to come to terms with in their own lives. We were basically told that we might meet a homosexual someday and then we should treat them in a Christian way. Consent, if it was mentioned at all, was not a central theme. It's funny for me to think that 6th class was also the time in primary school when we would have learned about the Mochanealach. But people are far angrier about learning the Mochanealach than they were about this parish-led sex education. In fact, when you talk to Catholic-raised people and they share these stories, the tone is often cheerfully dismissive rather than angry, as if receiving biased, incorrect information in the classroom wasn't disgraceful, but a charming quirk of Irish childhoods like red lemonade, ice cream wafer sandwiches, and troker boxes. But if you fast forward 30 years to where we are now, to COVID-19, and you look at the low take-up of mask wearing and the casual attitude of social distancing, you can ask yourself, at what point did people learn to be suspicious of state-led public health campaigns? Because it wasn't the Safe Cross Code. We're all fine with the Safe Cross Code. It has its roots in the early teenage years when fear-led, unscientific campaigns about sex, alcohol, drug abuse, these campaigns would concede that the classroom isn't the place. It's not the authoritative source of information when it comes to your own safety. So we ended up getting our information somewhere else, behind the bike sheds. For this secret curriculum that we learned behind bike sheds whispered by older children as they passed a cigarette around, it wasn't fact-based either, and it was also pitched to our fears. But it felt plausible. It seemed like it was a practical information, and they understood their audience better, knowing what we did and didn't want. And it felt more urgent because the timeframes involved seemed much shorter. They were talking about discos in the next week, as opposed to the lady from the parish talking about getting married in 20 years' time. And this is the kind of stuff that project managers mean when they say that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So at that time I was 12. Fast forward 2 years, and I'm in secondary school. And I'm 14 years old. And this is a very significant age in Ireland at the time, because there's another 14-year-old in the news every day. And she's referred to as Miss X. She was a girl who would have received the same quality and quantity of sex education as I did at the same time in a similar school. Her case at the country of light, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, who are from outside Ireland, she had become pregnant at the age of 14 by an adult neighbour. Her family wanted to present DNA evidence from a terminated fetus as evidence in the case against the neighbour, but they were prevented from travelling by an injunction from the Attorney General, and this is due to Ireland's constitutional ban on abortion. So discussions about this case were everywhere. Everyone was talking about it, and it came up in a number of classroom contexts when I was in school that year. In geography, we talked about the whole idea of borders and being able to cross them, and different countries next to each other having different rules and the consequences of that. We talked about the ethical issues of it in religion, the medical aspects of it in science class. And it even came up in Irish class, because there was a difference between the Irish and English version of the Constitution that referred to in what was called the Eighth Amendment. And to give an example, this is something that always stayed with me, because Irish had always seemed to be, at the time before what presented in not so urgent contexts. The English version was, the state acknowledges the right to life of the unborn, and with due regard to the equal right of the life of the mother, guarantees in its laws to respect and, as far as practicable, by its laws defend and vindicate that right. Ras Gaelgid, Avion an Stát ceart na beag an bhre, chun meitheamh agus ag feiceant go chuida comcheart na mar don a bheithe, rahéann sé go chuirsteach lena dlíthe ag an gheart sin, agus rahéann fós an ceart sin ag chusant lena dlíthe sa méid gur féidir é. Sa méid gur féidir was this big difference between as much as you can, as much as is practicable. And this is something lawyers argued about a lot. And suddenly Irish felt more urgent in a way that I hadn't seen before. Anyway, this national conversation led to the case. The national conversation around the case led to the proposal of 3 constitutional amendments, one of which was, and I remember it being stirred at this time, the right to information. The idea that our right to information, and Ireland was at the tail end of a very unlovely history of censorship, which took many long fights to reverse. If you've ever had a look at Ireland's Register of Publications, you'll see an alarming number of books there, an alarming number of detective stories, and things you never know why they're banned. Some of them were banned because of the ads they had at the back, which might refer to certain services that were illegal in Ireland. Some of them were because of the text themselves. And then for people who remember these struggles to reverse this censorship culture, it's heartbreaking to see, as we do see now, free speech becoming a battle cry for people who want to circulate hateful opinions and incorrect information. Certain internet platforms are better at standing up to this than others, and Wikipedia has absolutely been one of the better ones. So this right to information referendum, it did pass, but over 40% of voters in 1992, and this is a bigger vote than any political party got in the general election of the same year, 40% of people asserted that the state actually did have a right to pick and choose how much factual information its citizens were allowed to have access to. 4 in 10 adults expect to be censored and were comfortable with it. And I wonder how this debate would have played out. If it happened 4 or 5 years later, when the internet started making its way into people's homes, because that changed everything. Could I have written a book like Mother Folklore without the internet? And could I have written it more precisely without the internet culture that Wikipedia has cultivated? In 1997, I was a second-year student at UCD. At the time, undergraduate students could only get an email address through NetSoc, which was the college's internet society, and there's a limited number of email addresses available. Demand was so high that students queued from 6 in the morning to be sure of getting an email address. We wouldn't have internet access to the house for another year or so, and there was a scramble for computers at Belfield. It was very highly competitive, and certain students were privileged over others. In fact, when I was in 3rd year and some of my classmates went to Erasmus, I still communicated with them by written letter and the occasional phone call. When I started my master's thesis, the possibilities of the internet for research were only beginning to become apparent. It was during this time that I found an article on Warwick Pierce, which made reference to he was a leader in 1916, which I mentioned earlier, and it made reference to his interest in J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, which I also mentioned earlier, and how he had underlined a passage in his copy of Peter Pan, and the passage was, "To die would be an awfully big adventure." I found this link between this revolutionary who was so closely associated with the Irish language and this famous children's book by a Scottish author made into a Disney film. It shook me into thinking about both of these things differently. Particularly, it pointed me to examining Pierce's writing in a global context, after he'd always been presented to us as an insular and a narrow-minded, divisive figure. I started looking at his writings in the context of Victorian constructions of childhood and Victorian ideas of blood sacrifice, as well as comparing his work to that of Maria Montessori and other contemporary European educators. It's finding this thing which, if I had been searching for this in a physical library, I may have never found it, but the internet had made these possibilities available to me. When Wikipedia was launched the year after I finished my first master's, so I was one of the last people to study in a learning environment without it. I was one of the last people to have a Wikipedia innocent education. And I remember in one of the final seminars of my master's, which is in Anglo-Irish Literature and Drama, when our professor, Declan Kybert, he talked wistfully about the possibilities that were going to become possible in the next few years of a hyperlinked version of Ulysses, where a student could sink deep into the author's references to opera, to mythology, to contemporary court cases that Joyce was fascinated in, and Dublin history, which he was also fascinated in. He was talking about what information would do if it was allowed to move freely. So writing a memoir about my relationship with the Irish language and my father, which is what Mother Folklore is, it's a very different endeavour to writing a thesis. But there's still a certain amount of overlap when it comes to research, to deadlines, and to the anxiety that someone else had your ideas first. For me to make connections as I did between Alanis Morissette and Peg Sayers, between Brehon Law and the Irish Constitution, and to get the encouragement to move these connections from a hunch to a whole chapter in a book that would be reviewed critically. That required access to a place where I could skim first before deciding if I could dig deeper. And while I never used Wikipedia as a direct source, there are many times when it allowed me to see that a connection was worth pursuing. And when writing my books, running the Irish For on Twitter, and producing my podcasts, I had access to a suite of Irish online dictionaries: folklore.ie, changlin.ie, terma.ie, and dill.ie. I generally think the effort of computerizing these resources, hyperlinking their entries so meticulously, I think that was inspired by the Wikipedia ethic, rather than the approach of any other large website. It was about setting information free rather than using your search history to trap you and sell you things. While it can seem strange to hop, as I did earlier, from Peter Pan to bone marrow transplants to famous architects to a revolution in Ireland, the links in these topics are justifiable from the content of those pages, and more importantly, from the natural depth of those topics themselves. Surely it's far stranger that certain segments of human knowledge and experience are grouped together deliberately by people who are not always interested in them. Why would sex education group with religion? How did the very different human activities of mathematics and golf get themselves grouped with the idea of getting a sensible job, often one where you wouldn't necessarily be using advanced mathematics and golf in your day-to-day work in the office? But they got connected somehow. And if the Irish language is grouped with social conservativeness and the public sector, did those things become grouped with each other by association also? This is what knowledge is like when it's not set free. The apparent randomness of connected topics, rather than being frivolity, can be seen as reflecting a more thorough understanding of them and more reflective of how we engage with the world around us. When information is set free, it moves around. Knowledge goes forth and multiplies. This is something I'm very interested to see is being pursued in Finland, where I think phenomenon-based learning is replacing traditional subjects. With phenomenon-based learning, or PBL as it's called, no specific subject is taught, nor is there any preset learning objective. Rather, learners investigate and solve their own questions by applying what subjects are relevant to the problem. For example, to solve a question about climate change, knowledge is required from different subjects to science, geography, mathematics, and history. About a topic about World War II might also involve learning about the science of various advances, the geographical questions, the historical political questions, and maybe even certain language issues. So PBL shares this, or phenomenon-based learning, it shares similarities with project-based learning, problem-based learning, and inquiry-based learning, but the key difference is that PBL must have a global context and an interdisciplinary approach. This means the topic must be a real-world issue or a phenomena, and learners apply their different perspectives in order to study a topic. I absolutely love this idea. It reminds me of a great line from some anonymous wit. To teach science without humanities creates Bond villains. Teaching humanities without science creates Bat villains. So what's Irish connected to? The idea of a post-subject school fascinates me, because I'm often asked about my opinion whether Irish should be compulsory or not. It's one of those evergreen topics in the Irish media during the summer months, when newspapers traditionally need to fill column inches on those days when there's no Dáil debates, no big court cases, and no sport. It's something that we discussed in one of the most popular ever episodes of the Mother Folklore podcast, Hot Gale Summer, which is all about how middle-aged columnists, whose school days are a distant memory, they would defend their dislike of the Irish classes they took in the 1980s and 1990s by tenuously linking the subject, Irish, to social conservatism, racism, elitism, ableism, and so on. These issues, which they were suspiciously less eager to call out when they applied to issues like private school, health insurance, car insurance, urban planning, or the tax system. And believe me, apply they do. Being asked to read a book in school and not enjoying it is surely an unpleasant experience, but I'd like to think people can recover from it over time. What if Irish was allowed to occur naturally in the study of various phenomena, and figuring out those hard grammar bits became part of the larger problem-solving exercise? The significance of place names in geography, place names that came from Irish that may have referred to the natural and historical phenomena that occurred there. The way Irish sleeps in Hibernian English when we're studying literature. Why Irish has distinct words for certain scientific elements and scientific phenomena, like phosphorus, which is barish, and copper, which is ua, but not for calcium, for neon. Why some, not others? Just as mathematics and biology and French, they all have their place too in the study of Irish. When knowledge is set free, it likes to wander, find other knowledge, and make new knowledge. It reaches out to touch. And Wikipedia, more than any of the world's other most visited websites, is allowing that. While Facebook and Gmail present me with suspiciously bespoke ads, and social media platforms move our perception of where the middle ground is, our gut instinct of what's fair and what isn't, moving that middle ground on issues with articles and posts that they suggest we read. Wikipedia is held firm with its legion of volunteers, the volunteer ethic, and its 5 pillars. I'm so grateful that it exists. I'm so grateful that the Irish language version exists and is growing. And I'm just delighted to be here. And I hope everyone will have a fantastic conference. Darach Ó Séaghdha for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Darach. That was really interesting. I think your writing and the podcast is very much about, I suppose, confronting ideas about the Irish language that are so baked into our culture that it is this kind of nostalgic, retrospective, forced element of our culture that, speaking, and people who have met me at Celtic Knot will know this, that there is a perception that, Irish is not something that Irish people naturally move to en masse. It's something that is imposed upon us. And that in drawing together all of these cultural themes, you start to realize that is in itself a falsehood. And that really, that the idea that Irish sits outside of, the language sits outside of all other cultural happenings. And as you say, all of the huge cultural revolution that's happened in Ireland in the last 35 years.
I think so. And I think particularly one of the things I really noticed, and in the age of fake news and bot accounts and manipulation of elections, one of the things I've always found is whenever there was a natural grassroots movement, the Irish language always presented itself organically in it. Expressions like "make Raw the law" coming up, and Ashgar coming up in the 2 of the big referendums we had in the last decade in Ireland, whereas it didn't tend to come up, and when there wasn't an actual grassroots movement for it, it wasn't thought about. But when enough people got together, there was enough people with an interest in Irish who found it, and it turned up naturally in places where there were a lot of people.
What's interesting is, and for those who joined us for the social last night, Ciara Ní, she referenced in awe of Mná, which is kind of in awe being in English and Mná being the Irish for women, and how there's people have bags and badges with things like that written on. But the fact that her work very much references, I suppose, quite a lot of the feminist movements that have happened in the last 10 to 20 years, and the loosening of some of the societal restrictions that you were talking about. And I do find that quite interesting, that the people that are involved in kind of placing Irish as not as this kind of totemic thing that is dealt with reverence kind of by itself, but something that is very much part of the lived experience.
Yeah, and I think there is a tradition of activism within Irish, between whether it's the getting Gaelscoil set up, or whether it's seeking services, and whether it's issues relating to the problems in Gaelic areas, the physical and the problems there, and often activism becomes a very good habit, and it's rarely that people are only active in one thing.
So there's a few questions coming through, and I'm kind of drawing on some of the themes that people have been talking about. I mean, do you feel, I mean, even since you've started the Twitter, the Irish For, which is very much about kind of, I suppose, offering or starting conversations on what the Irish would be for very kind of modern or emerging terms. Do you think that, and that's my cat joining in there in the background, do you think that there's the attitude is still changing and has changed even within that time frame?
I think it's changed a bit, and I think the fact that I think people do see, and I was always surprised by the amount of engagement I got when people were interested in what an Irish word for something should be, and there was like even something like COVID-19, there was a disappointment. There was almost a disappointment that there wasn't a very bespoke or Irishy sounding word for it, and there was other people who would say, well, this is just how it's entering in all languages. It connects in a certain way. You might find in 10 years we will refer to it maybe as, just as we refer to World War II as the emergency, there probably will be a bespoke term. But I found that even people who didn't speak much Irish, when they heard that there was an Irish word for something like spam email being tuirshgar, which is the word for dead seaweed being dumped by the tide on the beach. People respect the fact that there was something that there was naturally occurring. They liked the fact that Irish was bio and they wanted it to be beautiful, even if they didn't speak it themselves. And that was something I always found, that there was, like, while you often see a separation between this perception of Irish speakers being this small group and everyone else being everyone else, there is a middle ground of people who want their children to have more than them, who would like to go back somewhere, who are looking for a way back in.
Definitely, and I think sometimes, there's kind of a surprise that, if you're listening to the Irish news, that it's called Brexit because it is a neologism that comes from English, and there is a difference. And I think for some of our French or continental compatriots, the fact that yes, we have Chandan.ie who you can submit requests to, you can say, what is, you come across a term that has no Irish equivalent, but we don't have the same kind of experience of perhaps maybe the French model, where it feels like there is a disconnect at times between how people actually speak to each other or communicate with each other on a day-to-day basis, and then what they are told, the terminology that they should use. So there is still an organic nature perhaps to Irish that maybe is somewhat of a European outlier, I don't know.
It's hard. I think there's different countries do have different, I guess, strategies for how they cope with the invasion of English words, and I suppose some people see it as more of a problem than others. You might find maybe in some countries maybe they don't see English as necessarily the enemy or not, or some places like France has a very strict. They do try to be quite strict about using as few English loanwords as possible. Sometimes that can lead to artifice, and sometimes it just comes across naturally, or you think actually that's better.
I think one of the things that both yourself and a lot of your contributors on Mother Folklore, so Oscar, Pather, Ola, lots of people have been, one of the questions that's come through presumably from an Irish person, and I definitely, and people called me out for it yesterday when I was trying to do the little bit of Irish. I was forever apologizing because I don't feel like a fluent Irish speaker despite 14 years of education like most other people. Do you think that we are still away from, there still seems to be kind of a hesitancy of people to reclaim what little Irish they have left, and perhaps a shame attached to that, so when they do go into perhaps a pop-up Gaeltacht or something like that, that they don't feel fluent, if the construct of fluency, and that stops them. Do you think we are improving slowly?
Oh, I hope so. I mean, it's possible that my experience of it is conditioned by the kind of people I hang out with, and so maybe I see a higher portion of people who have at least some interest in Irish than others. But there is definitely encouraging signs. I think the most encouraging sign is the most encouraging sign is the amount of people who would like to send their child to the Gael school. And we like to think that maybe in 20 years' time, there's going to be a lot more people who had Irish medium education, at least for primary or not, and see what they do with it.
A really interesting comment that's come through from Jason Evans in Wales. So in the Welsh school system, the Welsh Wikipedia is kind of being incorporated in various elements of the syllabus, and they're now moving towards a thematic syllabus as well. So, you know, there's always been, I don't know if it's jealousy or perhaps a little bit of envy of perhaps the Welsh experience as direct comparison perhaps to the Irish experience. You know, a language that was possibly more actively suppressed in recent memory, being Welsh, and, you know, Irish then and having a resurgence, and then Irish perhaps struggling despite having this top-down official acceptance of the language and I suppose prominence that it has. It
is interesting. I suppose a big thing was maybe that Wales probably had more inward migration in the 19th century, whereas we had more outward migration at that time. And in the early 20th, that is, Ireland and Wales have had very different experiences, very different histories going on. And then it is definitely one of the most inspirational minority language stories. But yes, they don't always. There's some things that we could definitely learn from the Welsh example, but there's lots of situations when they aren't exactly parallel. But I know T.G. Cowher was inspired by the Welsh television channel, I think.
So we can have our cultural cross-pollination, and it's just and I think everybody that's involved in the Celtic Knot will be very much aware. I mean, there's people from Breton, you know, Northern Sami, and despite geographical proximity, and especially going back way back when the seas were very much the byways and land was the barrier, that being close in proximity doesn't necessarily mean that you can make direct comparisons like that and make analogies. But I think on that note, thank you so much for joining us, Darach. I really appreciate it. I do have a few requests, but I won't put you on the spot as regards. We're going to get you to hopefully upload a photograph to Commons so that we can illustrate your Wikipedia article, and maybe look to getting a transcript so that we can caption the video and things like that. But I won't hotfoot you on that right now.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
It was an absolute pleasure. It's a fantastic start to our second day. And you're very generous with your time. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody would be really interested. If they didn't manage to catch it live, to catch up later. Thank you again, Darach. And for everybody watching on the stream, we now have our big long break. So you can have your lunch and catch up on all the videos perhaps that you didn't see yesterday in the video pool that we have. But from everybody who's watching, thank you all very much for joining us, and we will hope to see you later on today. Thank you. I think we're going to do the same thing. Yes, we'll have our slide. So if you want to wrap up in the comments, equally, if there's anything that you want to copy and paste over from the YouTube comments to capture it, and I know Andy has done a little bit of that to capture it in the Etherpad so it doesn't disappear at the end of it. Thank you all so much, and we will talk again later.